When you do something a follower of Jesus shouldn't do, it can be hard to overcome the feelings of guilt and the feelings of shame for doing something you shouldn't have done. But stop beating yourself up. In this teaching, I'm going to tell you about a powerful word Jesus used, and it'll encourage you as you figure out how to overcome those feelings of guilt and shame. Welcome to the Christian Bro Code YouTube channel. I'm your bro, Mario Escobedo. This channel is all about learning biblical principles that can help you grow. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Let's jump into the teaching. Now, for this teaching, I'm going to be looking at John chapter 20, verses 19 through 23. And before we look at the passage itself, let me give you just a little bit of context. Where does this take place in the life and ministry of Jesus? Well, by this point, Jesus had already been arrested, crucified, he had died, been buried, and he had resurrected. In fact, what we're going to see here in John 20, 19 through 29 takes place on the evening of the day of Jesus' resurrection. So Jesus rose in the morning, and this conversation took place in the evening of that same day. This is the first post-resurrection conversation that Jesus had with his disciples. Earlier that day, he had spoken with Mary Magdalene, but this is the first time that he was talking to all of the disciples except Judas, who had already hung himself, and Thomas, who wasn't there. Now, I did a teaching on Thomas and when he had that conversation with Jesus. You can check it out by clicking right about there, up there, or also checking out the description for a link to that teaching. Now, let's look at the passage itself, beginning to read in verse 19. This is what it says. On the evening of that first day of the week, that was the day when Jesus rose from the dead, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Now, let me point something out here real quick. It says that they were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders. Now, it makes sense to me that they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. What was their fear? Well, they were afraid that the Jewish leaders were going to do to them what they had done to Jesus because they were his followers. So obviously they're afraid. So when we read these first couple of verses, or this first verse, we discover that it's an environment or an atmosphere of fear and confusion that the disciples are going through at this point. Makes sense. It's obvious, right? And so it's important that the first words that Jesus shares with the disciples are, "Peace be with you." He's coming into a situation of fear and he's declaring peace. Now, the book of John was written in Greek, but Jesus and the disciples spoke either Hebrew or Aramaic. So when Jesus said, "Peace be with you," the actual word that he would have said would have been the word shalom. And this is the word shalom in Hebrew or Aramaic, same thing in both. And you pronounce it shalom, that's how it's written. And it means peace or tranquility, or if there's something chaotic or something like a tribulation or a storm or whatever, when you say shalom, it's a declaration of peace in that situation. So it's obvious that Jesus, the reason he spoke shalom this first time is because the disciples are afraid. He's walking into a situation of confusion and fear. So the first words to the disciples are shalom. Now keep watching. It's very, very interesting. After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. He's giving them evidence that it's actually him who rose from the dead. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Of course they were, right? They thought Jesus was dead, but here he is alive. So of course they're overjoyed. Look at what Jesus says next. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you." Again, he said, "Shalom." Now, that's interesting to me. Follow the sequence. Look at the sequence with me. The disciples were afraid, right? They were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Then Jesus walks into that situation of fear and he says, "Shalom," to calm their fear. As a result of that, they're no longer afraid, but now they're overjoyed. Still, in that situation of being overjoyed, Jesus says shalom again in order to do what? Right here, he said it to calm their fears, but now they're in a situation of joy and celebration. Why does he say shalom again? Well, there's more to the word shalom than just peace or tranquility. And this is where it gets really interesting. And we're going to start getting into how it applies to us in just a little bit. So keep watching. Watch to the end. Now, we said shalom means peace, tranquility, but shalom is more than that. It's actually like a concept, a pretty profound concept in Hebrew thought, because the word shalom can also mean something that is whole or complete or not missing anything. Imagine I have a sheet of paper, and that sheet of paper is shalom. It's complete, it's whole. If I were to rip a piece off of that sheet of paper, it's no longer complete. It's no longer shalom. That's the meaning, the idea of shalom. Let me take you to a passage in the Old Testament to give you some more understanding of this. It's going to pay off. Stick around. It's going to pay off. This is in Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 through 31. The people of Israel are in the promised land under Joshua's leadership, and they're going to renew the covenant with the Lord. This is what it says. Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones. I want to look at that word uncut because it's important in the understanding of what we're talking about here. That word uncut is a form of the word shalom. It's the word shalom as an adjective, but it's still the word shalom, and it means whole, complete, or not missing anything. Notice how in this context, there's no tribulation, there's no fear, there's no storm, there's nothing that requires peace or tranquility. In this context, the word shalom means something that is whole or complete. A rock in this case that hasn't been cut, hasn't been hewn, it's complete, it's whole, it's shalom. All right, so let's take that understanding of shalom and apply it to why Jesus would have said shalom again. So again, here's the sequence, right? The disciples were afraid. Jesus comes in and he declares shalom to calm down their fears. The disciples are overjoyed, but he says shalom again. And I think the second time Jesus says shalom, he's giving it the different meaning. He's giving it the meaning of wholeness, completeness, not meaning anything. Because at this point, Jesus says shalom to restore the disciples. I think that's a powerful concept. He's saying shalom in order to restore the disciples. Restore them from what? Well, just think about what the disciples were feeling when they saw Jesus. They thought he was dead. They're overjoyed because he's alive and he presents himself to them. And as they're there celebrating and they see Jesus, I think that all of a sudden there would have been incredible feelings of guilt and shame. Why? Because they abandoned Jesus. Because they neglected Jesus. Because when they came to arrest Jesus, for the most part, the disciples scattered. They weren't with Jesus. Just think about Peter and what Peter might have been feeling at that point. Peter was the one who said, Jesus, I'll go to the death for you. If I have to, I'll die for you. And it ended up being Peter who denied Jesus 3 times. Can you imagine with Jesus now standing in front of him, what Peter may have been feeling? I think he would have been feeling guilt and shame for having abandoned and denied Jesus. He did something that a follower of Jesus should not have done, and he was feeling the guilt and the shame for it. And in this situation, not just of fear, but also of guilt and shame, Jesus declares shalom a second time in order to restore the disciples, to tell them, I know what you did was wrong. I know that what you did is not something that a follower of Jesus should do. I know you're feeling guilt and you're feeling shame, but I'm here to declare shalom, wholeness, restoration over you despite of what you've done, despite what you did. I'm declaring shalom. I'm restoring you. So the second time that Jesus says shalom in this passage, I think that he's using it in that sense. Be complete, be restored. Eliminate, erase that shame, that guilt, all of that that's making you less than whole, get rid of it. And I just see myself a lot in these disciples because I'll tell you that I've done things that a follower of Jesus should not do. And I'll go to a worship service and I'll be in the worship and the presence of the Lord is beautiful. It's great. You can feel it. And then when I'm right in the middle of that worship service, it's as if I feel that guilt and that shame, and I'm like, how can I be worshiping the Lord? How can I be here in his presence when not too long ago I just did something that a follower of Jesus shouldn't do? That guilt and that shame just, it pops up, just like it did with the disciples. And it's in those moments that I have to believe that Jesus speaks shalom into my life. Not just to get rid of my fears, but to tell me, I can restore you from that thing that you did. I can make you whole again. I can get rid of that shame and that guilt that you feel because of what you've done. I speak shalom, wholeness, completeness into your life once again. Now, look what happens next. We read verse 20 again. After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed and they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, peace be with you. This is the part where he's saying, be restored, be whole, be complete. And then look at what Jesus said next. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And with that, I think that is so important, because here's what Jesus is saying. You haven't disqualified yourself from fulfilling the purpose that I chose you to fulfill. Jesus chose the 12 disciples in order to fulfill the purpose of advancing his mission, advancing his message. They abandoned him. Peter denied him. But here, after Jesus speaks shalom, then he says, as the Father has sent me, I'm sending you. You haven't disqualified yourself from the mission that I came to start and that I chose you to fulfill. And you need to understand that. We need to understand that when we mess up, because we are going to mess up, Jesus speaks shalom and restoration into our lives. And then he says, now keep pursuing the purpose I chose you for. Keep going after that purpose that I chose you to fulfill. You have not disqualified yourself from that purpose that I chose you to fulfill. Just like he told the disciples, go, I'm sending you. Yeah, you messed up. Yeah, I know you messed up. I know you abandoned me. Peter, I know you denied me. But you still haven't disqualified yourself from the mission that I chose you to fulfill. And bro, let me tell you, that when you mess up and you feel that guilt and that shame, you might feel like giving up, and you might feel like you're not worthy to continue on the path of growth and the purpose that the Lord chose for you. The truth is, we're not worthy, but he steps in with his grace, his restoration, his shalom, and he restores us, and he says, now get back on track. Keep going to fulfill the purpose for which I chose you. This is an incredible word for me. That word shalom, it's important because it speaks peace. Yeah, don't be afraid. But it also speaks restoration. Get rid of that guilt. Get rid of that shame. Overcome it and continue fulfilling the purpose for which the Lord chose you. Here's the big idea. Here's what I take away from this passage here. It's so important. Jesus speaks shalom into your life so that you can overcome your feelings of guilt and shame. And he does that because there's a lot of work to do in your family, in your life, in your marriage, with your kids. And as long as you're tied down by those feelings of guilt and shame and inadequacy, you're not going to be able to fulfill the mission that the Lord chose you to fulfill, whether it be in your own self, with your marriage, with your family, with your kids, at your church, with your coworkers, etc. And the Lord speaks shalom into you. He says, no, I'm forgiving you and I'm restoring you back to wholeness so that you can get back onto fulfilling the mission for which I chose you. This is incredible. This is such a huge benefit for us as followers of Jesus, and that helps us overcome feelings of shame and of guilt. That's it for this teaching. I hope that what I shared has encouraged you and has gotten you to the point where you know and believe that Jesus doesn't want you carrying around your shame and your guilt with you all over the place where you go. Let him speak restoration, shalom, into your life. Listen, there are other teachings like this one on this channel, and you can see some of them somewhere here on the screen. Go ahead, check them out, because I know that they'll be of benefit to you. Also, let me know what you thought of this teaching or of the other teachings as well. Share your thoughts in the comments. Give this video a like, definitely give it a share so that other bros can find it and benefit from it as well. I'll see you next time. God bless, bro.